The ceremony began, and Ethan's anxiety only grew with every passing second. The guests stood as the grand wooden doors swung open, revealing Emily, a vision in her flowing white gown. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her face glowing with happiness. But to Ethan, she looked more like a villain than a bride. He could see through her beautiful facade, and it terrified him. As Emily walked down the aisle, her blue eyes locked onto David's with a look of pure adoration. To anyone watching, she seemed to be the perfect match for his father. But Ethan knew better. He had overheard things, seen things that had kept him up at night, gnawing away at his peace. Just a week ago, Ethan had stumbled upon a conversation between Emily and a man named Mark, a name he had never heard before. She hadn't noticed him standing nearby as she hissed into her phone late one evening. Her words were sharp, angry, and filled with secrets. The kind of secrets a kid should never have to hear. "After the wedding, it's done," Emily had whispered furiously. "Once I have the policy, we move forward. David doesn't suspect a thing. We'll be set for life." The words had sent a chill down Ethan's spine. She was planning something that involved his dad and a mysterious insurance policy. Ethan hadn't understood everything, but one thing was clear. Emily wasn't who she appeared to be, and she had dangerous plans for David. Now, as she approached the altar, all eyes were on her, except for Ethan's. He couldn't stop staring at his father, trying to summon the courage to do something, anything, before it was too late. The ceremony continued, each word from the officiant like a countdown to disaster. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling as he gripped the pillow tighter. The pressure was mounting, and Ethan knew he had to act soon. If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The room went still. The air was thick with anticipation. But Ethan felt frozen. His mind raced. What if no one believed him? What if it made everything worse? His heart screamed for him to do something, but fear gripped him like a vice. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Time slowed. Emily glanced at him, her icy blue eyes narrowing, as if daring him to say something, as if she knew exactly what he had overheard and wasn't afraid to silence him. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "Wait," he blurted out, his words trembling, but loud enough to cut through the quiet. Every head in the room turned towards him, shocked. His father's eyes widened in confusion. The officiant paused, unsure of what to do, and Emily, her smile froze, faltering ever so slightly. "Ethan?" David said softly, stepping toward him. "What's going on?" Ethan's throat was dry, his voice barely above a whisper. But he forced himself to speak, knowing this was his only chance. "You can't marry her, Dad. You just can't." The entire room buzzed with murmurs as guests exchanged confused glances. Emily's face hardened. She quickly recovered from her momentary shock and flashed a warm but tight-lipped smile, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sweetheart," she said in a sugary tone, her voice dripping with false kindness. "I know this must be scary for you, but it's okay to have new changes in life. It's a big day for all of us." But Ethan shook his head vigorously, refusing to be dismissed like a confused child. "No, that's not it." His voice grew louder now, fueled by the urgency of the situation. "I heard you. You were talking about a plan to hurt Dad. You're lying to him. You're only marrying him for his money." Gasps filled the room. Emily's face went pale, but she quickly masked it with an incredulous laugh, though the panic was beginning to creep into her eyes. David looked between his son and his bride-to-be, bewildered. "Ethan," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" Emily stepped forward, reaching for David's hand, her voice calm but edged with desperation. "David, please. He's confused. He must have misunderstood something he heard." "I didn't misunderstand anything," Ethan shouted, his eyes welling with tears of frustration. "I heard her talking to a man named Mark. They're going to take your money after the wedding, and... His voice broke, his small body trembling from the weight of it all. David froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Emily, who was now visibly shaken, her perfect composure crumbling before the crowd. "Is this true, Emily?" David's voice was barely a whisper, but the question hung heavy in the air, filled with the kind of dread that only comes from a terrible realization. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked cornered, her eyes flicking between David and the watching guests, and then something shifted in her expression. Her warm facade dropped, replaced by something colder, more calculating. For a brief moment, she didn't bother to deny it. Instead, her lips twisted into a sneer. "You little brat," she hissed under her breath, her voice filled with venom. David stared in shock, finally seeing a glimpse of the woman Ethan had warned him about. His hands clenched into fists as the truth began to sink in. The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously to each other, some standing in disbelief, others looking towards the exits, unsure of what to do. Emily, realizing her mistake, quickly tried to backtrack. "David, no, wait, I didn't mean it. I was just stressed, with all the wedding planning, But it was too late. David took a step back from her, his face pale, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. You were going to hurt me?" Emily took a deep breath, her eyes darting to the side. "No, David, I swear it wasn't like that. I love you. I do. Please just—" "Who's Mark?" David's voice was louder now, anger finally breaking through his shock. Emily hesitated for just a second too long. David's expression hardened. "Answer me," David demanded. Emily's eyes flashed with anger, and in that moment, her mask slipped completely. She turned and bolted for the door. "Stop her," David shouted, but Emily was quick, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a shadow. Guests scrambled out of her way as she fled down the aisle, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a heartbroken groom. David rushed to his son's side, pulling Ethan close. "It's okay, buddy. You did the right thing." Ethan clung to his father, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." David knelt down and hugged him tight, his own voice cracking. "You saved me, Ethan. You saved both of us." Just then, sirens wailed in the distance, and David looked up to see police cars pulling up outside the chapel. He had called them earlier, unsure of what to expect, but now he knew. They weren't just there for a wedding disturbance. They were there to stop a crime. As the officers entered, David turned back to his son, his heart heavy but filled with gratitude. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. More than you'll ever know." Ethan nodded, his heart finally starting to calm as he realized that, despite everything, they were safe. But the danger wasn't over yet. As the police entered the chapel, their presence immediately commanded attention. Guests parted, clearing a path toward David and Ethan. Officer Johnson, the lead officer, approached cautiously, his eyes darting between the shaken groom and the now chaotic scene. "Mr. Matthews?" Officer Johnson's voice was calm but firm. "Are you the one who called?" David nodded, still holding Ethan close. "Yes, it's me, my fiancée, Emily. She just ran. My son told me she was planning something dangerous." The officer's face grew serious. "We're going to need details, Mr. Matthews, but first, can you tell us where she went?" David looked toward the open chapel doors where Emily had just fled moments earlier. "She ran out that way. She can't be far." Officer Johnson immediately signaled to the officers behind him. "Search the area. She's wearing a white wedding dress, blonde hair. Go." The officers sprang into action, rushing outside to begin their search. David watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. Just minutes ago, he was standing at the altar, ready to start a new life. Now, everything was unraveling in the most shocking way imaginable. "Dad," Ethan whispered, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What if she comes back?" "Dad," Ethan whispered, looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What if she comes back?" David knelt down to his son's level, taking a deep breath to calm himself. "She won't, buddy. The police will find her. You're safe now, I promise." But even as he said it, a part of David wondered if Emily was truly gone, or if she had more tricks up her sleeve. After all, everything he thought he knew about her had turned out to be a lie. How much more could she be hiding? Officer Johnson's voice interrupted David's thoughts. "Mr. Matthews, I know this is a lot to process, but we'll need to take your statement, both yours and your son's. It sounds like there's more going on here than just a runaway bride." David nodded, his mind still reeling from the betrayal. "Yes, Ethan overheard something. Emily was planning to hurt me. Something about insurance, money, and a man named Mark." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Mark? Do you know who this Mark is?" David shook his head. "No, I didn't even know she was talking to anyone else. I didn't know any of this until today." Officer Johnson sighed. "We'll look into it." It sounds like this might be more than just a case of cold feet. We'll need to search her belongings, her accounts, everything. But first, let's make sure you and your son are safe." David looked down at Ethan, who was gripping his hand tightly, still visibly shaken. He gave his son a reassuring squeeze. "We'll be okay," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Outside, the search for Emily intensified. Police officers scoured the surrounding area, checking nearby streets, alleys, and parking lots. But there was no sign of the bride. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a trail of suspicion and shattered trust. Back inside the chapel, David and Ethan were escorted to a quiet room where they could speak with the police in private. Ethan sat beside his father, his small hands still trembling slightly. He had been so brave, so strong, but now the weight of it all was starting to sink in. His dad was safe, but the fear and confusion from what he had overheard haunted him. Officer Johnson sat across from them, flipping open his notepad. "Ethan, I know this has been a scary day for you, but can you tell me exactly what you heard when you overheard Emily talking about this plan?" Ethan hesitated, glancing up at his father, who gave him a reassuring nod. "It's okay, son. Just tell him what you told me." Ethan took a deep breath and began. "I heard her talking on the phone a few days ago. She didn't know I was there. She was talking to someone named Mark. She said that after the wedding, they were going to move forward with something. Something about an insurance policy and getting money. I didn't understand everything, but I knew she was planning something bad. I just knew." David squeezed Ethan's shoulder gently, proud of his son's courage, but heartbroken that he had been forced to carry such a heavy burden alone. Officer Johnson scribbled down notes, his expression growing more concerned. "Did she say anything else about this plan? Did you hear her mention what they were planning to do to your dad?" Ethan nodded, tears filling his eyes again as he recalled the chilling conversation. She said they were going to get rid of him. After the wedding, when everything was in place, I think she was talking about hurting him. Maybe even worse." David's breath hitched in his throat as he processed his son's words. Emily, no, the woman he thought he loved, had been planning to hurt him, to take his life for money. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and anger. How could he have been so blind? Officer Johnson closed his notepad, his face grim. "Thank you, Ethan. You did the right thing by speaking up. You probably saved your dad's life." Ethan nodded, though the weight of what he had just revealed hung heavily in the air. "We're going to issue an alert for this Mark as well," Officer Johnson said, turning to David. "Whoever he is, he's clearly involved in this. We'll dig into Emily's, well, whatever her real name is, background. There may be more to her than you know." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I just don't understand how I missed all of this. She seemed so perfect." Officer Johnson nodded sympathetically. "People like her are good at hiding who they really are. It's what makes them dangerous. But the important thing is, she didn't succeed. You're here, and you have your son to thank for that." David looked at Ethan, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah," he said softly, "I do." The hours passed, and as night began to fall, David and Ethan were allowed to leave the police station. The officers assured them that they would continue searching for Emily and Mark, and that they would do everything in their power to protect them. But the feeling of unease remained. As David and Ethan drove home, the quiet of the night settled in around them. The reality of the day's events had left them both emotionally drained, but there was also a sense of relief. They had escaped something terrible, something that could have ended in tragedy. And though they didn't have all the answers yet, they had each other. And that was what mattered most. When they finally pulled into their driveway, David turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He glanced over at Ethan, who was staring out the window, his face tired but thoughtful. "You okay, buddy?" David asked gently. Ethan turned to him, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I think so." David smiled, though there was still a sadness behind his eyes. "You were really brave today, you know that?" Ethan shrugged. "I just didn't want anything bad to happen to you, Dad." David's heart ached at his son's words. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. You did something incredibly hard today, but you saved us both." Ethan managed a small smile. though the weight of everything that had happened still hung between them. As they walked into the house, David knew that their lives would never be quite the same again. The woman he had almost married was a stranger, a dangerous stranger, and they were still in the shadow of her betrayal. But tonight, they were home. They were safe. And that was all that mattered. As David and Ethan stepped inside their home, the house felt strangely quiet. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that neither of them could shake, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of the day's events. David locked the door behind them, double-checking the bolt, his mind racing with thoughts of Emily and her mysterious accomplice, Mark. He was doing everything he could to reassure Ethan. But in truth, he felt like his whole world had been shattered. They moved into the living room, both of them still rattled. Ethan looked exhausted, his small body sagging with the burden of everything he had experienced. "You hungry, buddy?" David asked, trying to return to some sense of normalcy. "I can make us something to eat." Ethan shook his head. "Not really, I'm just tired." David knelt in front of him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Why don't you head up to bed? Get some rest. We'll figure everything out in the morning." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously toward the dark hallway that led to his bedroom. What if she comes back? David's heart sank at the fear in his son's voice. "She won't, Ethan. I promise you, she won't come near us. The police are going to find her, and we'll be okay." But as the words left his mouth, David felt the weight of uncertainty settle deep in his gut. He had no idea where Emily was, what she might be planning, or how far she was willing to go. Ethan nodded slowly, though he still looked scared. "Okay, Dad." David walked him up to his room, making sure to check all the windows and locks as they went. He tucked Ethan into bed, sitting beside him for a moment, the soft glow of the nightlight casting a dim halo in the room. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," David said quietly, brushing a hand through his son's dark curls. "You were brave today. You did the right thing." Ethan blinked up at his dad, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I didn't want you to get hurt." David's throat tightened and he leaned down to kiss the top of Ethan's head. "I know, and because of you, I didn't. You saved me, buddy. You saved both of us." Ethan's eyelids fluttered as he drifted off to sleep, his small body finally relaxing into the comfort of his bed. David sat with him for a little while longer, just watching his son breathe, letting the calm of the moment settle in. But when David finally rose and walked back downstairs, the unease returned. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and the thought of Emily still out there gnawed at his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed Officer Johnson. "Officer, this is David Matthews. I just wanted to know if there's any news on Emily." There was a brief pause before the officer's calm voice came through the line. "Mr. Matthews, I understand your concern, but we don't have any updates yet. We've issued an alert and we're monitoring all the places she might try to run to. Rest assured, we're doing everything we can to find her." David exhaled, trying to let the officer's words reassure him. "Thanks. I can't believe this is happening." "It's understandable," Officer Johnson replied. "But stay vigilant. If anything happens, if you hear from her, or if you see anything suspicious, call us immediately." "I will," David promised, though the pit in his stomach only seemed to grow deeper. He hung up and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television without turning it on. His mind replayed the events of the day. The way Emily had transformed from a loving fiancée to someone he barely recognized. The coldness in her eyes when Ethan revealed her secret. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and he was finally seeing her for what she truly was. But the hardest part to swallow was how blind he had been. How had he missed all the signs? How could he have fallen so deeply for someone so dangerous? David couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside made him jump, his thoughts circling back to Emily's escape. He kept imagining her plotting somewhere, planning her next move. She had disappeared without a trace, and that's what terrified him most. She had been so careful, so methodical in hiding her true self. What if she knew how to vanish just as expertly? Hours passed in a blur of anxious thoughts until the first light of dawn began creeping through the curtains. David finally dozed off for a brief, restless sleep on the couch, his mind still racing. The next morning, David awoke to the sound of the doorbell. He jolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. For a brief second, a wave of panic washed over him, but then he remembered the events of the previous day. It wasn't a dream. He hurried to the door and opened it cautiously, only to be met by Officer Johnson standing on the front step. "Mr. Matthews," the officer said, his expression serious, "we have some news." David felt his stomach tighten. "What is it? Did you find her?" Johnson sighed, shifting slightly. "Not yet, but we've uncovered more about her. It turns out Emily isn't even her real name. She's been using multiple aliases, and she has a history of cons and fraud. This isn't the first time she's targeted someone for financial gain." Johnson sighed, shifting slightly. "Not yet, but we've uncovered more about her. It turns out Emily isn't even her real name. She's been using multiple aliases, and she has a history of cons and fraud. This isn't the first time she's targeted someone for financial gain." David felt the floor drop out from under him. "So, everything she told me was a lie?" "Looks that way," Johnson said grimly. "She's been involved in similar scams before, but this was on a whole different level. We've been working with other jurisdictions to piece together her history, and it seems like she's been doing this for years. There are multiple victims." David's head spun. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed someone so dangerous to enter his life and nearly destroy it? "And what about this Mark?" David asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Who is he?" Johnson's face darkened. "We believe he's her accomplice. He's been involved in several of her past schemes, though we're still working to track him down. It's possible they've been working together for a long time." David clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up inside him. "I can't believe I didn't see any of this." Officer Johnson placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. "These people are professionals, Mr. Matthews. They know how to manipulate, how to blend in. But your son, he saw through it. You're lucky he did. Most people don't get that chance." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if Ethan hadn't said something." "We're going to find her," Johnson said firmly. "I promise you that. But in the meantime, we need you and Ethan to stay safe. We've put extra patrols in your neighborhood and we're monitoring any leads. If she tries to contact you, call us immediately." David thanked the officer and closed the door, leaning back against it as the weight of everything pressed down on him. Emily had been living a lie. Everything he thought he knew about her was false. And now, she was out there, somewhere, plotting her next move. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't let her hurt his family. Not again. As the days passed, David did his best to keep life as normal as possible for Ethan. He still took him to school, helped with homework, and made sure they spent time together, just father and son. But the shadow of Emily's betrayal loomed large over everything. Every time the phone rang, David felt a surge of fear. Every unexpected knock at the door sent his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was out there watching, waiting. Then, one afternoon, as David was sitting at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed with a new message. "Unknown number. You thought you could get rid of me that easily? Think again." David's blood ran cold as he stared at the message. It could only be from one person. Emily. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the message, his hand trembling slightly as he held his phone. The words on the screen seemed to pulse with threat. "You thought you could get rid of me that easily? Think again." It was Emily. She hadn't disappeared. She was out there, and worse, she was watching him. David immediately stood, glancing toward the stairs where Ethan was playing in his room. He couldn't let him know about this. Not yet. The boy had been through enough already, and the last thing David wanted was for him to live in fear. He quickly dialed Officer Johnson, his voice low and urgent when the officer answered. "Officer, it's David Matthews. I just got a message from her, Emily. She sent a text." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Officer Johnson's voice sharpened. "What did it say?" David swallowed hard, reading the message aloud. "She said, you thought you could get rid of me that easily? Think again. What should I do?" "Don't respond," Johnson ordered. "Keep your phone on, and I'll send someone to trace the number. Whatever you do, don't engage with her. We're going to handle this." David nodded, though his nerves were frayed. "How could she even know where I am?" "It's possible she's using different contacts, Or maybe she's still keeping tabs on you somehow, Johnson replied. We're going to figure it out, but you need to stay calm and keep yourself and Ethan safe. David thanked the officer and hung up, but he could feel the anxiety tightening around him like a vice. He glanced around the house, his paranoia spiking. Was she nearby? Watching from somewhere? How much did she know? How close was she? He couldn't wait around feeling helpless. He needed to do something, anything, to protect his son and himself. David checked all the locks again, moving through the house with a new urgency. The security system was on, but it felt like nothing was enough to guard against someone like Emily, someone who knew his weaknesses, his routines. He wondered if she had someone helping her, like this mysterious Mark. Was he the one spying on them? David's thoughts spun as he returned to the living room, phone still clutched tightly in his hand. He had been wrong to trust Emily, wrong to bring her into their lives. And now he was paying for it. But no more. He had to take control. The hours ticked by painfully slowly. Ethan remained upstairs, thankfully oblivious to the fear gripping his father. David kept his phone close, waiting for Officer Johnson's call. He checked the windows periodically, eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. When the phone finally rang, it startled David out of his thoughts. He answered it immediately. Mr. Matthews, Johnson's voice came through, calm but serious. We traced the number, but it's a burner phone. No way to track it directly. David cursed under his breath. So what now? What do I do if she contacts me again? David cursed under his breath. So what now? What do I do if she contacts me again? We'll keep monitoring the situation, Johnson said. For now, I suggest you stay vigilant. Keep your phone on, and we'll station officers near your home. If she's nearby, we'll catch her. We're putting out all the stops on this. David thanked him again, though his nerves were far from settled. Burner phones, anonymous messages. Emily was playing a dangerous game, and she knew how to stay one step ahead. He could feel her slipping through the cracks, taunting him with every move. Later that evening, David was sitting on the couch, still wired from the day's events, when he heard a faint rustling sound outside. His entire body went tense. It was just a small noise, probably nothing more than the wind. But after the message from Emily, every sound seemed suspicious. Every shadow seemed like a lurking threat. David stood and moved cautiously toward the window, peering out through the curtains. The street outside looked empty, quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, just the glow of streetlights casting long shadows over the pavement. But something didn't feel right. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. David nearly dropped it as he fumbled to unlock the screen. Another message had appeared. Unknown number. Still think you're safe? David's blood ran cold. He glanced out the window again, scanning every corner of the street. Was she out there, watching him? His pulse raced as he dialed Officer Johnson once more. I got another message, David said as soon as the officer picked up. His voice was tight, fear seeping into every word. She said, Still think you're safe? Johnson didn't hesitate. Stay inside, Mr. Matthews. Lock the doors, check your windows. We're sending officers to your location now. David hung up and immediately went into lockdown mode. He checked every window and door again, his heart hammering in his chest. Was she outside? Had she been watching them this entire time? He couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. Minutes later, 2 police cruisers arrived outside the house, their lights flashing in the dark. David watched from the window as officers stepped out, scanning the area carefully before approaching his door. He let them in, trying to calm his racing mind as they began questioning him about the messages. We'll do a thorough check of the area, one of the officers said, his voice steady. If she's anywhere nearby, we'll find her. David nodded, grateful for their presence, but still on edge. It felt like Emily was everywhere and nowhere at once, a shadow just out of reach. The officers moved through the house, checking each room and making sure all the security measures were in place. But as the minutes dragged on, there was no sign of Emily. She had left no trace, and David's frustration grew. How does she know so much? David asked, his voice strained as he spoke with one of the officers. How does she know where I am? She's using burner phones, but how is she staying so close without being seen? The officer sighed. She's been good at covering her tracks so far, but we'll catch her. People like her make mistakes eventually. We just have to be ready. David nodded, though the pit in his stomach only seemed to deepen. He had trusted Emily once, and it had nearly cost him everything. Now, he didn't know if he would ever feel safe again. After a while, the officers finished their sweep of the area and reported back to David. "There's no sign of her, but we'll keep someone posted nearby. If she tries anything, we'll be here. Don't hesitate to call us if you notice anything else." David thanked them as they left, feeling a mix of relief and dread. The house was secure, the police were nearby, but Emily was still out there. Somewhere. He locked the door behind them and walked back into the living room, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He needed to stay strong, especially for Ethan's sake, but the fear was relentless. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was still one step ahead, playing some twisted game with their lives. That night, David didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside set his nerves on edge. He kept his phone by his side, checking it constantly for more messages. But none came. By the time morning arrived, David felt like he had barely blinked. His body ached from tension, his mind fogged with exhaustion. But when Ethan came downstairs, rubbing his eyes and asking about breakfast, David forced a smile. "Pancakes sound good?" he asked, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Ethan nodded, still half asleep, and David got to work in the kitchen. As he flipped pancakes on the stove, his mind kept drifting back to Emily. She had made her move, reached out with those chilling messages. But now what? What was her plan? What was she waiting for? As he served breakfast, David glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the street once more. It seemed quiet, peaceful. But he knew better. Emily was out there, lurking in the shadows, and until she was caught, David and Ethan were far from safe. As David poured syrup over Ethan's pancakes, he tried to push away the gnawing sense of dread. He needed to focus on his son, on keeping their routine as normal as possible. But every time his phone buzzed or the house creaked, his mind jumped back to Emily. The looming threat of her presence seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Ethan sat at the table, his small hands wrapped around a glass of milk, looking up at his father with sleepy eyes. "Are you okay, Dad?" he asked quietly. He was a perceptive kid, more than David sometimes gave him credit for. David smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm okay, buddy. Just a little tired, but don't worry about me." Ethan nodded, but there was concern in his expression. After all, he had been the one to uncover the truth about Emily, and now David could see how much it weighed on him. He had been forced to carry the burden of knowing his father was in danger, and though he had spoken up bravely, the fear hadn't left him. As Ethan ate, David's mind wandered back to the messages. Emily had reached out to taunt him, but there was something deeper in her words, something darker. She wasn't just trying to scare him, she was preparing for something. But what? The police were watching the house, but Emily was clever. She had managed to disappear into thin air, leaving no trace of herself behind. How long could she keep this up? And when would she make her next move? Later that afternoon, David found himself pacing the living room, unable to sit still. He had spoken to Officer Johnson again, but there were no new developments. No sign of Emily, no clues about where she might be hiding. It was as if she had simply vanished after sending those 2 chilling messages. He glanced out the window again. The police cruiser parked a little way down the street, providing some small comfort. But it wasn't enough. David's nerves were raw, his every instinct telling him that Emily was lurking just beyond his reach, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the hours passed, David decided to take matters into his own hands. He needed to know more about Emily, about the woman who had so thoroughly deceived him. He needed to understand her, to figure out what her next move might be. He sat down at his laptop and opened a browser, typing her name, or rather, the name she had used with him, into the search bar. Emily Mason. Nothing came up that seemed relevant. David then remembered what Officer Johnson had said about her using multiple aliases. She could be anyone, and that made his search feel hopeless. Still, he pressed on, combing through different articles, crime reports, and forums about con artists. But everything was vague. There were hundreds of stories of people like her, people who manipulated others for financial gain, leaving wreckage in their wake. Yet none of the stories gave him the answers he needed. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He closed the laptop, rubbing his hands over his face. How could someone be so close and yet so elusive? He had lived with Emily, shared his home and his heart with her, and now she was a stranger. Worse, she was a dangerous stranger. Someone who had almost succeeded in destroying his family. The phone rang again, and David's pulse quickened as he grabbed it, hoping for news from the police. But when he looked at the screen, his heart sank. It was another unknown number. His thumb hovered over the answer button, dread crawling up his spine. Against his better judgment, he answered. There was silence on the other end, a thick, suffocating silence that made David's skin crawl. Then a familiar voice cut through the static, soft and cold. David. His stomach twisted at the sound of her voice. I warned you, didn't I? Emily's voice was eerily calm, but there was an edge to it, a menace that made David's blood run cold. You think you can hide behind the police, that they can protect you? You don't know me at all. David's hand tightened around the phone. He had no idea what to say. What could he say to someone like her? What do you want? He finally forced out, his voice strained. Emily laughed, a low, unsettling sound that sent a shiver down David's spine. I already told you, you thought you could get rid of me so easily, but I'm not done yet, David, not by a long shot. David glanced out the window again, his eyes darting to the police cruiser. You won't get away with this, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The police will find you. Will they? Emily's voice dripped with mockery. I've been doing this a long time, David. You're not the first man I've played, you won't be the last. David's anger flared. You lied to me, you manipulated me, and you tried to hurt my son. Do you think I'll let you get away with that? For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then Emily's voice returned, colder than before. You think you're in control, don't you? But you're not. You never were. David's breath hitched. He knew she was toying with him, trying to get into his head. But there was something about her voice, something that told him she wasn't bluffing. Leave us alone, Emily, David said, his voice hardening. Stay away from me and Ethan. There was a long pause. Then, almost in a whisper, Emily replied, It's not over, David. I'm just getting started. The line went dead. David stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. His mind raced with possibilities. What did she mean by it's not over? What was she planning? The vague threat hung in the air, chilling him to the bone. Without wasting another second, David called Officer Johnson again, his voice tight with panic. She just called me, David said, pacing the living room. Emily, she said, she's not done, she's planning something. Did she say where she is? Johnson asked, his voice steady, but urgent. No, just more threats, David replied. She said it's not over and that I don't know her. I think she's close. She's been watching us. We're going to increase patrols in your area, Johnson said. We'll trace the call, but it's probably another burner. Don't engage with her if she contacts you again. Just let us know. We're closing in on her, but you need to stay vigilant. David hung up, his hands shaking. The police were doing everything they could, but Emily seemed to be slipping through their fingers at every turn. She was always one step ahead. David knew he had to stay strong for Ethan, but the constant fear was eating away at him. Every shadow outside the window, every unfamiliar car on the street sent his mind spiraling into panic. How long could they keep this up? How long until Emily made her move? That evening, as David tried to get through dinner with Ethan, the unease continued to gnaw at him. Ethan sensed it too, though he didn't say anything. He just watched his father with worried eyes, silently picking at his food. Everything okay, Dad? Ethan asked after a while, his voice soft. David forced a smile, though it felt weak. Yeah, buddy, everything's fine, just a lot going on. Ethan nodded, but David could see the doubt in his son's eyes. He wasn't fooling anyone. After dinner, David helped Ethan get ready for bed, tucking him in and sitting by his side until the boy drifted off to sleep. But even as Ethan's breathing slowed, David's anxiety only grew. The house was too quiet, too still. As he sat in the dark, watching over his son, David couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was out there, waiting for her moment. He didn't know when or how, but she was going to strike again, and this time, he feared, it would be far worse than before. David sat in the quiet of the house, every sound amplified by his racing heart. After putting Ethan to bed, he had settled into the living room, unable to sleep. unable to shake the sense that something terrible was about to happen. Emily's voice still echoed in his mind, her threat playing over and over again. "I'm just getting started." He stared at his phone, waiting for it to buzz again, dreading another message or call from her. The minutes stretched into hours, and the house remained eerily silent. But David knew that Emily wasn't done. He could feel it. She was out there, watching, planning, and now she had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop until she had finished whatever twisted game she was playing. The police cruisers outside were a comfort, but David's anxiety continued to gnaw at him. He walked to the window for what felt like the 100th time, peering out into the night. The street was empty, except for the faint glow of the streetlights and the parked police cars. There was no sign of Emily, no movement at all. But the stillness only made David more nervous. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly his phone buzzed again. David's stomach twisted as he glanced at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. David's stomach twisted as he glanced at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. Unknown number. "Miss me yet?" David's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, the sinister undertone to every syllable. She was toying with him, enjoying the fear she was instilling. But he couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her know how terrified he was. He immediately called Officer Johnson again, his voice tense. She sent another message. "What did it say?" Johnson asked, sounding just as frustrated as David felt. David read the message aloud, his mind racing as he spoke. "She's taunting me. She's enjoying this, officer." Johnson's voice hardened. "We're keeping a close eye on your area. Stay inside and don't respond to her. We'll try to trace this message, but if it's another burner, it'll be difficult. I know this is hard, but we need you to stay calm." David thanked him and hung up, his hand trembling as he set the phone down on the coffee table. "Miss me yet?" The words lingered in his mind, poisoning his thoughts. Emily had a plan, he just didn't know what it was yet. But he could feel the noose tightening. Unable to sit still, David paced the room, his mind working overtime. He had to do something, anything, to protect Ethan. Emily had already tried to manipulate and harm him. She had come into their lives pretending to be someone she wasn't, and now she was unraveling everything. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let someone so dangerous get this close? The thought of her lurking somewhere nearby, waiting to strike, filled him with dread. But more than that, it filled him with anger. She had fooled him, made him question everything he knew, but he wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. David walked to the front door and peered out into the dark street again. The police cruisers were still there, but there was no sign of movement, no indication that Emily was close. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching. His phone buzzed again. His heart leaped into his throat as he picked it up, his hands shaking slightly. Another message from the unknown number. "Unknown number. It's lonely out here. Why don't you come find me?" David's blood ran cold. She was playing a twisted game, trying to lure him out, trying to provoke him, but he wasn't going to fall for it. He had to be smart, for Ethan's sake. Just then he heard a soft thud outside, something barely audible but enough to catch his attention. David froze, his ears straining to listen. Was it the wind? Or was it something or someone moving around outside? His mind raced as he walked back to the window, carefully parting the curtains to look out. At first, everything seemed normal, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a shadow moving near the side of the house. His heart pounded as he strained to see more clearly. Was it Emily? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? David's breath caught as the shadow shifted again, this time closer to the back of the house. Someone was out there. He rushed to the back door, locking it securely, his heart racing. The police were just outside, but he didn't want to take any chances. He grabbed his phone and called Officer Johnson once more, his voice shaking. "Officer, someone's outside," David said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I saw a shadow near the back of the house. I think it's her." "We're sending someone around the back right now," Johnson said quickly. "Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't go outside. We'll handle it." David backed away from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear his own breathing, fast and shallow, as he tried to stay calm. His eyes darted to the stairs, where Ethan was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just outside. Minutes passed like hours. David stood frozen, waiting for the sound of the police outside, waiting for some sign that everything was under control. But the house remained silent. Too silent. Then, there was a knock at the front door. David's breath hitched. He moved cautiously toward the door, glancing through the peephole. It was Officer Johnson. David unlocked the door and let him in, his voice shaky as he spoke. "Did you find her? Was it Emily?" Johnson stepped inside, his face grim. "We didn't see anyone, but we found footprints near the back of the house. They look fresh." David's heart sank. "So she was here?" Johnson nodded. "It's possible, but we're not sure if it was her or someone else. Either way, we're going to keep officers stationed around the house tonight. If she's nearby, we'll catch her." David rubbed his temples, exhaustion and fear weighing heavily on him. "I can't believe this is happening. She's out there, isn't she? Watching us." Johnson sighed. "We'll find her, Mr. Matthews. Just hang in there a little longer. She's getting desperate, and that means she'll make a mistake soon. We just have to be ready." David nodded, though the pit of dread in his stomach only seemed to grow deeper. Emily was out there, and she was getting closer. But what terrified him most wasn't that she was near. It was the fact that she had a plan. And whatever it wasn't over yet. The night dragged on, but there were no more messages, no more signs of movement outside. David sat on the couch, unable to sleep, his mind too wired with fear and anger. The police had done a full sweep of the area, but Emily had vanished again, leaving behind only those footprints and the chilling messages. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, David finally allowed himself to relax, just a little. He had made it through another night. But the unease still clung to him like a shadow, and he knew that as long as Emily was out there, he and Ethan were far from safe. He got up from the couch, stretching his aching muscles, and walked upstairs to check on Ethan. His son was still sound asleep, curled up in his bed, unaware of the nightmare his father had been living through the night. David leaned against the doorframe, watching his son for a moment. He had to protect him. No matter what happened next, he couldn't let Emily get to him. He had already come too close to losing everything. Just as David was about to head back downstairs, his phone buzzed again. His heart leaped into his throat as he checked the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "Unknown number. See you soon." David's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a promise. Emily was coming, and this time she wasn't going to stay hidden. With his heart pounding, David called Officer Johnson one last time. "She sent another message," David said, his voice shaking. "She said, 'See you soon. She's coming for us.'" Johnson's voice was firm but calm. "We're increasing patrols around your house right now. Don't worry, Mr. Matthews, we're going to catch her." But as David hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was already closer than they realized. She was playing a game he was only just beginning to understand. And now, with her final message, it was clear that the endgame was near. Emily was coming, and there was no way to stop her. David's mind raced as he processed Emily's latest message. "See you soon." It was no longer just a game of taunts. This was real. Emily was coming, and it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. He could feel it in his bones. He paced back and forth in the living room, trying to calm his thoughts. Officer Johnson had assured him that more patrols were being stationed around the house, but even with the police nearby, David couldn't shake the fear that Emily was somehow always one step ahead. She had been so precise, so calculating in everything she had done so far. What if she had a plan that no one saw coming? He looked up the stairs, where Ethan was still sleeping. His son's safety was all that mattered. If Emily tried to come near them, David would be ready. He had to be. The hours ticked by painfully slowly. Every sound in the house set David on edge, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside. His phone remained silent, but the tension in the air felt like it was suffocating him. He couldn't sit still, couldn't let his guard down. He moved through the house, checking the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked. His eyes flicked toward the backyard, where the police had found those fresh footprints the night before. The hours ticked by painfully slowly. Every sound in the house set David on edge, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside. His phone remained silent, but the tension in the air felt like it was suffocating him. He couldn't sit still, couldn't let his guard down. He moved through the house, checking the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked. His eyes flicked toward the backyard, where the police had found those fresh footprints the night before. It was clear now that Emily had been there, just feet away from him and Ethan. What had she been planning then? What was she planning now? Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. David's heart leaped into his throat. It wasn't the police. No sirens, no flashing lights outside. He cautiously moved toward the door, glancing through the peephole. No one was there. His pulse quickened. Was she playing games again? Was she toying with him, lurking just out of sight, knowing the fear it would instill? David stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He was about to turn away from the door when another knock came, this one louder than before. He pressed his face closer to the peephole, squinting into the dim early morning light, but there was nothing. Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket. His hand shook as he pulled it out, already dreading what he would see. Another message from the unknown number. Unknown number. Look outside. David's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to follow her command. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she was getting to him. But he had no choice. He had to know what she was planning. With his breath held, he slowly pulled back the curtain of the front window and peeked outside. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The street was empty, quiet. The police car was parked down the block, just as it had been all night. But then, his eyes caught something. A small, white envelope lying on the front porch. It hadn't been there earlier. David's stomach turned. He had no idea what could be inside, but he knew it had come from Emily. His instincts screamed at him to leave it, to let the police handle it, but he couldn't. He needed to know what she had left for him. With a shaky breath, David unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, and the silence around him felt heavy, oppressive. He bent down to pick up the envelope, his heart thundering in his chest as he turned it over in his hands. There was no name on it, no address, just a plain, white envelope. David glanced up and down the street, half expecting to see Emily watching from the shadows. But there was no one. The quiet stillness of the neighborhood only heightened his unease. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him, and sat down at the kitchen table. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, just like Emily. David, I told you I'm not done yet. You think you can hide behind the police, but that won't stop what's coming. This ends when I say it ends. You won't know when or how, but I'll be there when you least expect it. Until then, take care of Ethan. He's the only thing keeping you from losing it all. See you soon. David's hands tightened around the paper as he read the words. The threat was clear, chilling in its simplicity. She was going to come for them, and it wasn't a matter of if. It was a matter of when. He immediately called Officer Johnson, reading the letter aloud as the officer listened intently. We'll send someone to collect the letter, Johnson said, his voice tense. But don't engage with her, David. She's trying to rattle you. The more you play into her game, the more control she has over you. I know, David said, though his voice was shaking. But she's watching us. She knows too much. She's making you feel trapped. That's what people like her do. But we're not going to let her win. David hung up and set the letter down on the table, his mind racing. Emily wasn't just threatening him anymore, she was threatening Ethan. The very thought of her even mentioning his son sent a wave of fury through David. She was using Ethan as leverage, toying with his deepest fears, and it made his blood boil. He had to protect Ethan, no matter what. He couldn't afford to let Emily get inside his head, couldn't let her use his love for his son as a weapon against him. But the weight of it all, the fear, the anger, the constant vigilance, was beginning to take its toll. David couldn't let her win. He wouldn't. The hours crawled by, and David couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was watching, waiting for her moment. The letter had been her way of asserting control, reminding him that she was out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Every time his phone buzzed or there was a noise outside, his body tensed with the expectation of her next move. Ethan was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. David had made sure not to mention the letter or the messages or anything that might scare him. He had tried to keep their routine normal, but the tension in the house was palpable, even if Ethan didn't fully understand it. That evening after dinner, David sat with Ethan as he played with his toys, trying to distract himself from the creeping anxiety that gnawed at him. But every time he looked out the window, every time he glanced at his phone, the fear came rushing back. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. David froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He stood slowly, glancing at Ethan, who was still absorbed in his play. He moved cautiously toward the door, his mind racing. Could it be the police? Or had Emily come back? He glanced through the peephole, his breath catching. It wasn't a police officer, it was Emily. She stood on the porch, calm and collected, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She wasn't wearing the wedding dress anymore. Now she was dressed in dark jeans and a black coat, looking almost casual. But her eyes were cold, calculating, and David could see the malice behind her calm exterior. For a split second, David froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. She had come, just as she had promised. She was here. Emily smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down David's spine. She raised her hand and knocked again, this time louder. David's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he backed away from the door. He grabbed his phone, dialing Officer Johnson with shaking hands. "She's here," David whispered urgently into the phone. "Emily's here, at the door." "We're on our way," Johnson replied, his voice steady but tense. "Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't open it. Do not engage with her." David hung up, his heart pounding in his ears. He glanced back at Ethan, who was still playing, completely unaware of the danger just outside. David moved quickly to the front door, making sure it was locked, then stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't let her inside. He couldn't let her get anywhere near Ethan. Another knock came, louder this time. "David, open the door," Emily called from outside, her voice smooth and mocking. "I just want to talk." David stayed silent, his body trembling with fear and anger. "David." Emily's voice was sharper now, a cold edge creeping into her tone. "We both know how this ends. You can't keep hiding from me." David backed away from the door, his hands shaking as he tried to keep his breathing steady. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but he wasn't sure if they would get there in time. Emily knocked again, harder, more insistent this time. "David," she called, her voice dripping with menace. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just let me in." David's mind raced. He couldn't open the door. He couldn't let her in. But she was so close, just on the other side of the door, and the fear clawed at him, threatening to overwhelm him. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. David held his breath, listening. There was a moment of silence, and then, nothing. He rushed back to the window, peeking through the curtain. Emily was gone. The porch was empty. But as the police sirens grew louder, David knew that this wasn't over. Emily had vanished again, just as quickly as she had appeared. But she was still out there, lurking, waiting. And next time, she wouldn't just knock, she would break down the door. To be continued. Thank you for watching. If you've been on the edge of your seat with this story, trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. Emily may have disappeared for now, but her next move is going to shock you. And David isn't ready for what's coming. The tension is about to hit an all-time high, and you won't want to miss it. So make sure to. Thank you for watching. If you've been on the edge of your seat with this story, trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. Emily may have disappeared for now, but her next move is going to shock you, and David isn't ready for what's coming. The tension is about to hit an all-time high, and you won't want to miss it. So make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications for hopeful blessings, because the next chapter will leave you speechless. What happens when Emily finally breaks through David's defenses? Will he be able to protect Ethan when the danger closes in? Stay tuned, because the twists and turns are just beginning, and you won't believe what happens next.